I'm very happy to be talking to Korean Buddhist television. All of my, friends in Korea, I have just a deep personal affection for the country of Korea and the culture and people. So I'm really delighted to be here today to be in conversation with Korean Buddhist television. I grew up in a family where my mother was a painter, a very prolific painter. She painted her whole life and she just loved painting. And she loved looking at the world through an artist's eyes, a little bit like Claude Monet, that she saw shadows and reflections and colors and all sorts of things like that. And I grew up loving that, seeing that through her eyes, going to museums a lot with my parents. My father was a world-famous scientist, what you'd now call a molecular immunologist at Columbia University here in New York City. And he was a professor in 4 different departments and very well-known. And so I grew up with a father scientist and a mother artist. And from a young age, I was always interested in, well, these are both 2 different ways of knowing. And I could see that my father knew the world in a certain way. My mother knew the world in a certain way. And as a child, I was wondering, is there a way to include art and science together in one understanding? And when I discovered Buddhist meditation in the Zen tradition to begin with, and when I was a graduate student myself in molecular biology at MIT back in the 1960s, in the laboratory of Salvador Luria, who won the Nobel Prize while I was in his laboratory. MIT is, of course, one of the top universities in the world, science and engineering. And their biology department and all of the neuroscience that has grown out of that original biology department when I was there are just world-class and world-famous. It was discovered that it was the genetic material the year I was born, 1944, here in New York City by Avery, McLeod, and McCarthy at what was then called the Rockefeller Institute. But then Watson and Crick in England at the time discovered the double helical nature of DNA. Watson was Salvador Luria's first graduate student. Okay, so there's a kind of lineage on the science side that's just like lineage in the Buddhist side. You go from teacher to student to teacher. Luria's student won the Nobel Prize 20 years before Luria himself won the Nobel Prize, which is really interesting. So I was so interested in things that had to do with the mind. Luria often would get quite upset with me because I wasn't paying enough attention to the bacteria and the molecular biology, because I was also asking questions about the nature of the mind, which is a very important biological problem, but nobody could answer those kinds of questions, so he would get frustrated. And once he said to me, he said, Jim Watson was my first graduate student, and you're going to be my last graduate student, because I really drove him crazy with these kinds of questions. But then we became friends long after I got my PhD, because I moved near him. We both lived in the same neighborhood in Lexington, and he became head of the cancer center at MIT before he got cancer himself. And he even at one point in his last years asked me if I would teach him to meditate. So this for Luria was like unbelievable, because he thought meditation was really silly. It was like a father and son type of relationship. There's an interesting story which I wrote up in my book, Coming to Our Senses, which is translated into Korean. I wrote up the story of my thesis defense at MIT, where, you know, in order to get your PhD, you have to give a lecture to a whole bunch of like top-notch scientists who are on your committee, and they have to like your lecture enough and like your thesis enough to say, okay, now you're a doctor, now you're a PhD. So, and it's usually quite intense. And I had, you know, several Nobel laureates around the table in my thesis defense. And the men started out the conversation by saying, okay, what is this sentence at the beginning of your thesis? He who dies before he dies does not die when he dies. And I said, do you really want to talk about this? I mean, I have my whole study here, and, you know, it's very complicated, and I need time to talk about it. They said, no, talk about this, he who dies. Because these were all men, except for the one woman, who were in their 50s. They were already famous and highly accomplished, probably had done their most important work already. I think that's true. And they were closer to death than I was by a generation. And so this must have interested them. What does it mean to die before you die? And so they said they wanted to talk about it. I said, okay, and then I gave them a little course in Buddhism and in, you know, the nature of like who dies when we die. Maybe what we're talking about is kind of the ego. And if the ego were to die, then in a sense, you'd be living a much fuller life. So that's what I thought it meant. And this went on, but it went on for maybe half of my thesis defense was a kind of Dharma talk and conversation about dying before you die. So the name of the Zen master that I first got exposed to sitting meditation practice and Chan or Zen practice was named Philip Kapleau, who had written a book called The Three Pillars of Zen. And a professor in philosophy and religion at MIT named Houston Smith, who was very famous, had invited him to MIT. So I started meditating the day he gave his talk, and basically following a kind of practice that involves sitting in silence, in stillness, and attending to the feeling of the breath moving in and out of the body. And then when the mind wanders, which it does all the time, to notice that the mind has wandered, that it has a life of its own, it kind of like waves, like the surface of the ocean. But that you don't have to be captured by all that waving, but in the stream of thought, but that you can recognize it and then come back to the body and the felt sense of the body breathing. Instantly knew this is what I've been looking for my whole life, to bring these different ways of knowing together. So from that day, I started meditating. And 55 years later, I'm still meditating. I started meditating in 1965, at that time. That was the era of sex, drugs, and rock and roll, and the beginning of the Vietnam War. It was a very, very crazy time. And so meditation was kind of looked at in the same way as maybe crystal gazing or astrology or things like that. It was like the far side of the lunatic fringe. So if you became a meditator, you were like really, really weird. And I was never interested in Buddhism per se in terms of teachers. I was interested in the teachings. In the Pali language, the Buddha taught that the first noble truth is the noble truth of suffering. In the Western countries, often it was distorted as life is suffering. But the Buddha didn't teach life is suffering. The Buddha taught there is this problem of human suffering. It's a diagnosis. And so we can treat it. But the opposite of dukkha is sukha, sweetness, okay, non-pain. So the liberation is the discovery that if you don't pursue sukha and push away dukkha, you're already free. The yin-yang, so to speak, of interconnectedness, non-duality. The beauty of the Zen or Chan or Son tradition in Korea is that awareness is non-dual. It's like space. It holds the whole universe of the mind. So if you fall into this and that kind of mind, or liking or disliking kind of mind, that's dualism. But the Buddha's teaching is non-dual. That's the sort of liberative domain of wisdom. And my Korean Zen master, teacher, Songsan Sonsenim, from the Jogye order in Korea, he used to talk about this all the time. Cambridge Zen Center, which was one of the centers that we set up for Sonsenim in Cambridge, Massachusetts, Harvard and MIT, or in Cambridge, a lot of students would come. He'd imitate it. He'd act it out for us. He'd sit up on his cushion, and and he didn't know that much English. But he was so brilliant that he could take English, even though he didn't know much English, and turn it into like fantastic teaching, Dharma teaching. So he would do stuff like this. And you have to imagine bald shaved head and round face and Korean robes and a big Zen stick, beautiful carved Zen stick. And he'd sit up like this and he'd close his eyes, and then he'd get a kind of puzzled look on his face, and he would go like this. What am I? And then there'd be a little stretch of silence. We're all sitting there watching this, And then he'd get another puzzled look on his face, and he'd go, don't know. And he was basically teaching us the importance of not knowing. Awareness of how much we don't know. And this is really the heart of mindfulness, is like knowing what you don't know, or even knowing what you don't even know. And so his teaching on that score was really very theatrical, really remarkable, hysterically funny. He had a fantastic sense of humor, but it was really powerful non-dual teaching. So that was like a very powerful formulative part of my young upbringing, so to speak, in the early first 10 years or 20 years of my meditation practice. And one day, he asked me if I would give the Dharma talk. And so I gave a talk, and he sits next to his teachers in training. And I'm supposed to give the talk, and then he'll answer the questions. So I gave a talk. So I give my talk, and then it's time for questions. I say, are there any questions? A hand goes up to the middle of the room, and a young man, asks a question. And the question was really crazy. I mean, it was so crazy. Because the Zen Center attracts like all sorts of people, maybe on drugs, maybe just with serious mental problems. I mean, so everybody is attracted to Zen in the 1970s, and I don't remember at all what the question was. The question was so disturbing that everybody's eyes turned towards the questioner. So you could see the whole room turning like, and then when he finished, they all go back to Sansanim. What's he going to say? And Sansanim's sitting there, and then he takes his glasses and he kind of puts them like this, and he looks over his glasses and he peers over towards this guy, and he's holding his Zen stick and he's rubbing his head, and he says, "You crazy." And I'm thinking, sitting right next to him, Sansanim, that's not so good to say. When somebody's really crazy, you don't say you're crazy. But he wasn't finished. So it seemed like a very long time after he said, "You're crazy," but it was probably only a few seconds. But he said, "You crazy, but you're not crazy enough." And the whole room went, "Oh, wonderful." Now, I don't know whether it was helpful to this guy or not, but it was so compassionate. The most important message is, and he lived that way, he never gave up on anybody. He would work with anybody. So the principle that I learned from that is that you never give up on anybody. As long as they're willing to do the work, I'm willing to work with them. The awareness and the compassion that comes out of, because mindfulness and heartfulness are the same thing. This is like, it's not like, then there's compassion different from mindfulness. No, they're the same. So that when you embrace a difficult moment with compassion, and including self-compassion, then new dimensions open for possibility and experience and growth that were there, or let's say that were here all the time, but unless you practice, you don't have any way of accessing them. He was not my only teacher. I studied with many, many teachers in many, many different traditions. But that non-dual foundation to the teaching has always been the essence of what we teach in MBSR. Because if we're not teaching non-duality, we're not actually teaching mindfulness. And if we're not teaching mindfulness, we're not teaching Dharma. And if it's not Dharma, it's not worth teaching in the first place. Because I had been doing molecular biology in a laboratory in the anatomy department at the University of Massachusetts Medical School. That's a whole other story. But I had been invited to come and work in somebody's laboratory and do molecular biology because I was a molecular biologist. And the guy who invited me, who's a world-class scientist himself, named Robert Singer, who's now at the Rockefeller University, he said, "Well, if you come and work in my lab doing all this molecular biology of RNA and things like that, muscle development, I'll let you teach gross anatomy with the medical students." And I said, "Well, how can I teach gross anatomy? I don't know any gross anatomy. I'm not a doctor. I've never dissected a human cadaver." And he said, "Well, none of us really knew any anatomy. We just do it. We're one step ahead of the students." So I said, I almost went to medical school just so that I could learn this kind of stuff. So I said, yes, I'll work in your lab as long as I can learn the gross anatomy and so forth. So that was how I got to UMass. And then after 3 years, I didn't want to do that anymore. I was turning 35 years old, and I was already feeling, well, I need to find out what my true work is on the planet. And I'd been asking myself that for 10 years, going on meditation retreats, and really not in some kind of very intense way, but within the back of my mind, what is my true work? And the challenge for me over the years was, how do you take this from sort of the various traditions of Asia, which are very, very highly evolved and just full of beautiful symbolism and stories and everything else, to help people find this doorway into themselves? And how do you make that available for mainstream Americans who don't know any of that culture? And then on a meditation retreat at the Insight Meditation Society in Barre, Massachusetts, at about day 10 of a 2-week retreat, in the afternoon, sitting in my room, it came to me that I would bring all of these years of practice of Buddhist meditation without the Buddhism, is the way I sometimes spoke about it, which is like true Dharma or universal Dharma. It can't be contained with words at all, including names like Buddhism or not Buddhism, because that's itself dualistic. I would like to bring that into mainstream medicine and healthcare, because people will benefit from it. I mean, people are suffering. Hospitals are dukkha magnets. Dukkha is the Buddhist word for suffering. So if people are going to the hospital because they're suffering, what better place to teach them how to be in wise relationship with the kind of suffering that cannot be cured by surgery or drugs? And I wrote up a proposal to the hospital to do that. And I had no training in psychology or clinical experience working with medical patients at all. But I had this PhD from MIT in molecular biology with a Nobel laureate. And that kind of, people just think, if he has a PhD from MIT in the laboratory of a Nobel laureate in molecular biology, he must know what he's doing. So let's let him do it. There was no model for doing anything like what I did with MBSR, at least that I knew of, because the idea was to bring Buddhist meditative practices without the Buddhism into the mainstream of medicine. So let me just say that in order to do this kind of work, I had to find one word that people could understand, that was an English word, that would allow people to at least grab onto something. In English, the words medicine and meditation sound a lot alike. Because medicine and meditation come from the same deep etymological root, that there was some kind of way to rationalize doing this that actually made sense to people. But it was an experiment to see whether you could take meditation practice, which nobody did in the United States and everybody thought was crazy, and offer it to people falling through the cracks of the healthcare system. In other words, even in 1979, it's much worse now, but people with chronic medical conditions, very often there are no really good treatments for most of them. So they just suffer and they keep coming back to the hospital, but it's not very satisfying. And the idea of MBSR was, what if we tried to teach people that there was something you could do for yourself as a complement to what all your doctors and people were doing for you on the healthcare team, but you had a certain responsibility to participate by cultivating awareness of your own body and mind and how to nurture it or investigate it in ways that would actually collaborate with your doctors and healthcare team to move you towards greater and greater levels of well-being and health, starting from wherever you started from, which might be right after a heart attack, or might be with a chronic cancer diagnosis, or anything like that, or headaches, or chronic back pain, or, we see people we invited people with all sorts of diagnoses. This was revolutionary because in medicine, you define the diagnosis as best you can through clinical assessment, and then you develop specific treatments for specific diseases. But we were saying, no, we'll take everybody, no matter what disease or chronic problem they have, and we'll put them all in the same room together. Well, that's like crazy. Except they all have something in common. Because one, they're alive. Two, they're breathing. Three, they have bodies. Four, they have minds. Those four things, that's enough to build a curriculum around. So we took everybody and we demonstrated that you could take people with a whole range of different kinds of medical diagnoses that were not well treated within modern medicine and help people to, in 8 weeks, feel better, say that they felt better, that there was less stress, that they had more opportunity, and then we do follow-up studies, up to 4 years worth of follow-up studies. If you continue to practice the meditation in one way or another, to some degree or other, you continue to derive benefits. So the ingredients of it were Buddhist meditation, in the sitting position, walking position, lying down position, standing position. These are the 4 classical meditative postures: sitting, walking, lying down, and standing. And you can cultivate moment-to-moment, non-judgmental awareness in all of those postures. If you do it lying down, though, and of course we couldn't teach people to sit on the floor, on the zafu or meditation cushion right from the beginning because they're in pain. And this just makes more pain. And the longer you sit, the more pain there is. So I decided right away, okay, we have to start teaching people to meditate lying down. Now, they never do that in meditation centers in Asia because there's one big problem with lying down, and that is that people fall asleep. As soon as you begin to feel even a little bit more relaxed, you go, and you're asleep. But meditation's about learning how to fall awake, not to fall asleep. So I developed this guided meditation called the body scan, which is based on more something that I experienced in the Theravadan tradition of Buddhism, the tradition of Ubakin and Goenka, kind of a scanning the body meditation, where you scan very high resolution scanning of sensory experience through the body. Usually they start from the head and they go all the way to the feet in the sitting posture. But I said, well, our people can't do it quite like that. It's too intense. But lying down and start as far away from the head as possible, because here's where all the problem is. And my head is, my mind is so plagued by thinking and reactive emotions, I can't have a moment of peace. But, well, can you feel your feet? Can you feel your toes? Now, most people that never even been asked that question, So then, okay, I'll experiment. I'll lie down in what we call the corpse pose. There are like 84,000 main yoga poses, 10 variants of each one of them, so 840,000 yoga poses. It's said that the corpse pose is the hardest, even though you're not doing anything and there's no effort involved. But it's said that it's the hardest because you get so lost in thought. So you're moving through your body, you're lying down, and you put your mind, say, in your left foot. And you say, can I feel the toes of my left foot? Yes. What do they feel like? No. No's okay too. Maybe it feels like no toes, or numbness, or dullness, or aching, or sharp shooting pain, or it doesn't matter. It's the awareness that's important, not the sensation. The awareness of the sensation. So when you practice in this way, move all the way through the left leg, you go over to the toes of the right foot, then you move all the way up the right leg, then you move up through the whole body, and then you start with the fingers and the thumbs, and you move all the way up through the arms, and then you move all the way up through the neck and head. 45 minutes. So it's very challenging just to lie still for 45 minutes on a hard, well, usually is on the floor, on a mat on the floor, not on the bed, because in the bed you'll fall asleep immediately. People loved it. They absolutely loved learning how to fall awake and then resting in awareness so that even if some part of your body really hurt, wherever it is, your back or your face or whatever, you began to learn from your own experience that you could be with the pain and not turn it into suffering, that the sensory domain of it actually is okay. What usually makes it suffering is our emotional reactivity and our thinking about it, like, I can't stand this, this is killing me, it's going to be forever, it's ruining my life. All of those are just thoughts. But when you believe them, they turn into the truth. So this is one of the ways in which the practice is liberating. As soon as you see that this is killing me and you investigate, you ask, is it killing me in this moment? And most people say, well, it's not killing me in this moment. I can tolerate it right in this moment. But if it goes on like this for another 5 minutes, I'm going to kill myself. But you say, well, but wait a minute. Mindfulness is about being in the present moment. So the 5 minutes is just another thought. That's just another future thought. It's a figment of your imagination. Can you stay in this moment? And this breath? And then this moment? And this breath? And people discover, I can actually live with this pain. In fact, after a certain point, we don't even want to call it pain anymore. We call it intense, unpleasant sensation. So many people nowadays, and it's always been true, I mean, to be human is, in some sense, to have experienced trauma, sometimes horrible trauma. And people say, I can't even live with this. But there is a way, and it's being called trauma-sensitive mindfulness, where you actually help people to find their own wholeness, that is what holds the scars and the hurt, and then realize that the scars are very real, but they're only a part of you, that the larger you, and ultimately your awareness, was never hurt, cannot be hurt, because it's like space, it's like free. And so it has enormous medical consequences, health consequences, across all diagnoses, because it's as long as you have a body and a mind and breath and sensations and you're alive, you're going to have the possibility of being in relationship with pleasant, unpleasant, and neutral experiences, moment by moment by moment. But if you haven't trained your mind to be in relationship with unpleasant experiences or even pleasant experiences, you can lose your mind either way. But it all comes down to the mindfulness. It all comes down to the practice. And it is a practice. It's a way of living. It's, present moment is also like space. It's infinite. And so that gives us room to live fully while we're alive, and then at the end of that, die. But most important is to live fully and then let the dying take care of itself later. the heart of the Buddha's teaching that the Buddha himself said in all the texts is spoken of as mindfulness. Mindfulness is the direct path to liberation from suffering. And mindfulness, the way I define it operationally, is it's awareness. Okay, if you wanted one word, it's awareness. If you wanted two words, it's pure awareness. Another word for it would be relationality, how we are in relationship to everything. So we say, my body. But whose body? Who's saying my body? Is it the body saying my body? Is it the mind saying body? Well, what's the difference between mind and body? So, big puzzle, big question. Mindfulness is the awareness. My working definition is that mindfulness is the awareness that arises from paying attention on purpose. You decide to do it, it's intentional. In the present moment, because that's the only moment you could ever pay attention. And then non-judgmentally. Sometimes in English people misunderstand it and they say without judgment. But non-judgmentally doesn't mean without judgment. Because when you watch your own mind, you discover almost instantly, I have judgments about everything. I like this, I don't like that, I want this, I don't want that. And it's like, so you're non-judgmental doesn't mean you won't have judgments. It means that you'll try as best you can to suspend all this judging, and then you won't judge how much you're judging anyway. And that's actually a gift to yourself, to just let the judging happen, just like the waves are, going up and down on the Pacific Ocean or whatever. But the mind isn't just the surface of the Pacific Ocean, it's the whole, all the way down. So if you go down even 30 or 40 meters under even a big storm, calm. So even under the most stressful, challenging difficult life situations, there is a way of connecting with a kind of stillness that has clarity to it. And that's embodied mindfulness. That's wakefulness. That's what the Buddha was teaching originally. And all the different Buddhist traditions are very different, culturally different, skillful means for bringing this to people so that they can not as a philosophy or as a catechism or a kind of belief system, because it's not about believing something. It's a practice. It's a way of being in relationship with reality. And when you follow that way, or Tao with a capital W, or a capital T, or D if it's Tao, then you almost instantly come in touch with a new way of being in relationship to everything, including stress, pain, illness, what you most don't want to face. And that is wisdom and liberating. Also, since I started studying MBSR by myself, because I knew as a scientist, if I just do this clinical program in the hospital and I don't study the outcomes scientifically and publish scientific papers about it in the medical literature, this will not change the world. It'll just be some nice little anecdotes that happened in one little hospital, and it will never spread. When I published my first paper in 1982, so that was one paper that year on mindfulness with the word mindfulness in the title. It's kind of at a very, very low level, right through the 1980s, a few papers here and there, starts to go up in the 1990s. And by the late 1990s and the early 2000s, it's starting to go higher and higher. And now it's going straight up. It's an exponential rise. So after about 10 years of gathering data on all of these thousands of patients who were going through the stress reduction clinic through MBSR, I felt it was time to not just write scientific papers about it, which I was doing, but to write a book about the curriculum of MBSR. So I wrote this book called Full Catastrophe Living in English. My editor, who was at a big publishing house in New York City, said, you can't call it Full Catastrophe Living because you can't put the word catastrophe in the title of a book. Nobody will buy the book. I mean, it's too scary. So I tried to get rid of that title. I thought of thousands of titles, but the title wouldn't get rid of me. It needed to be that title for all sorts of reasons.
No drugs and perform no surgery. Together they represent a growing field of medicine which
had never seen these things before.
People will carry a lot of baggage about what a meditation is, and we want to dispel those notions right away. So we'll say, look.
So it turns out that I didn't know it. In 1991, I think, there was a giant fire in California, in Oakland. Oakland is a giant city next to Berkeley, and the fire swept through the hills of Oakland and burned thousands of people's homes. And Bill Moyers, who was a journalist for public television, he went there with his television crew to interview people who had survived the fire, but their homes, they lost their homes. And it turns out that one person that Bill Moyers was interviewing was holding a book. And the book was Full Catastrophe Living. And that's how Moyers heard about the book. And he asked about it, and the guy said, well, like, this is the full catastrophe. I've lost my home, I've lost my possession, but I'm still alive. So Moyers became interested in the book, and then he was invited by a number of different foundations to do a public television, a 5-part public television series that wound up being called Healing and the Mind, to study from a kind of television point of view what we knew about the mind-body connection and healing. So because he saw the book, he got his producer to contact me at the University of Massachusetts Medical Center. And so they came to interview me, and they sat in on a class. They decided after sitting in on one class, we got to put this in the show. And they turned that 45 minutes into a guided meditation, the whole thing. And at the end they put a body scan towards the end of it. And when I had finished the scanning of the body right up through the top of the head, I stopped talking. And they kept the audio recording and the camera, and we just rested there in silence, and they kept the silence. Now this is like the first rule that you never break in television is no dead airspace, they call it in English. Never have no silence, because you'll lose people's attention. Instead, what happened, because the whole thing was a kind of seduction, a guided meditation into silence, 40 million people saw the first time it was played, and the silence just sucked them in a certain way. So we had phone calls from thousands of people, including lots of doctors. I don't know what I just saw, but I want that. That, of course, made MBSR much more famous in the United States. And then they showed that program on public television lots of times over the years, so people could see it they still show it. So that was the beginning, in some sense, of mindfulness getting out there in the mainstream world in a way that it hadn't been up to that time. And all of it's because of the science. If there were no scientific basis, Moyers would not have filmed it. But you also have scientific evidence that meditation can actually help people to, in some sense, heal and grow and learn and be more healthy. So that has actually helped generate interest among young students in neuroscience and clinical psychology, and I want to do this. I want to work in this kind of arena. And so that was one of a number of major accelerants, I call them, like throwing gasoline on a small fire, and you get a much bigger fire. Well, the Moyers program was one. Mindfulness-based cognitive therapy in 2000, when the first paper came out about it, was another one. The neuroscience papers that started coming out, Richard Davidson's work at the University of Wisconsin, all these things started to mushroom. And if you plot the number of scientific papers per year, not just in the brain. The brain, all sorts of things change in the brain. We drive what's called functional connectivity, neuroplasticity of all kinds, regulating emotions, regulating attention, regulating executive functions so that you actually know what's going on, regulating your sense of self and how much your sense of self imprisons us. So all of that happens, but it's not just the brain that changes with this kind of training. The genome changes. So this loops back to my original training in molecular biology. Is like we can actually change how our genes are expressed. It's called epigenetics, and upregulating and downregulating when you meditate thousands of genes, some of which have to do with inflammation and proto-oncogenes and things that have to do with health and disease. They actually benefit from cultivating mindfulness. And then there's also telomeres, these repeat subunit DNA bases at the ends of all of our chromosomes, and which are absolutely essential for cell division. And stress shortens the telomeres. So if you undergo lots of stress in your life, or it reduces the lifetime of the cell, after a while it can't, the genome can't reproduce anymore. The chromosome can't replicate itself anymore, so that cell dies. That's called cell senescence or cell death. But if you practice mindfulness, there's all sorts of evidence that the genome actually rebuilds those telomeres at the tips of your chromosomes. Elizabeth Blackburn won the Nobel Prize for her work on telomeres, and Alyssa Epel in her laboratory, and she wrote a book together on the telomere effect and how meditation can actually make those telomeres longer and reduce the speed at which they're degraded. So those scientific technologies were not remotely existent in 1979 when I started MBSR. But now they're showing us that you can change your biology by practicing what looks from the outside a lot like nothing. But it's not nothing. It's what I call non-doing. It doesn't mean you're not doing anything, but it's like you're cultivating being. And as in human being. So when we exercise that muscle, we're healthier, we're happier, we're more adjusted, and we're also smarter in a certain way because we're recruiting a whole spectrum of intelligences. And we need to be as smart as a species as we can be in this day and age because we've got global warming, because we've got nuclear weapons, because we have all this animosity between countries and all this competition that potentially could lead to, major disasters in a lot of different ways. The one area that we have not explored, we're so technologically precocious, is the human mind, who we are as human beings. So in a sense, mindfulness is not just a nice, interesting medical intervention or psychological intervention or some nice thing that we can do aside from yoga and running or swimming or taking care of ourselves. It may be the absolute core, essential opportunity for us as a species to grow into everything we already are. But I do feel like we have the explosion of a renaissance now that's not just in Western Europe. It's a global renaissance. But to use it in a way that furthers human understanding, liberation, kindness, compassion, and so forth. And when people say, I'm not a racist, I have black friends or stuff like that, you don't realize, like, you're almost by definition a racist because race itself is a kind of form of violence as a thought, because you're Korean and I'm American. We could say you're one race, I'm another race. But there's only one race. There's the human race. But when we fall into othering and separating ourselves into then we don't like the Koreans, and we only like white-skinned people or Caucasian people, or, this is the source of so much violence, of so much ignorance, of so much delusion. So if you think of this as Buckminster Fuller once called planet Earth, he called it spaceship Earth. We're living in one spaceship, all of us, all black, white, all sorts of different peoples are living all together on the one spaceship. We need to think more like that we need to take care of the spaceship, and we need to learn how to live with each other in the spaceship, so to speak. Because maybe when there were 1 billion people on the planet, it wasn't such a problem. But with 7 billion people and soon 9 billion people on the planet, it's a big problem. More than 50% of those people have almost no resources. So in a spaceship, that would never be allowed, right? Everybody has to have food. Everybody has to have the right accommodations and so forth. And of course, when you're raising children under conditions of terrible poverty, you create disease. There's poverty equals disease. So if we're talking about just healing and the health of the body politic, we need to deal with these injustices, these inequalities, as opposed to more for me and less for you, and I don't care about you, I only care about me. That's a form of violence, it's a form of ignorance, and we see what the consequences of it are just in terms of the harming of the planetary environment. The ice caps, Antarctica, the melting of the Greenland, ice sheets, the disappearing of the glaciers in Switzerland and in, the sort of the Arctic, and how people are in China or elsewhere in the world, in India, are going to get water when the Himalayas don't have any more snow, or much, much less snow. I mean, that's could be the end of life on this planet as we know it. But I feel like the Renaissance could actually be a new giving birth to what humans are truly capable of on this planet. And there's a certain urgency to it, because now, if we could, we'd take the planet to the hospital, because the planet has a fever. But there's no hospital big enough to hold the planet except for the human heart. So when we take the planet into the human heart and recognize that we're the ones that have given it this fever, then maybe human intelligences, when we recruit them all together and unify them through mindfulness and heartfulness, maybe we have a way to thread the needle that will lead to well-being, not just for our children's children, but for our children's 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 children. And that's why I keep doing what I do. So let's take a few minutes and just settle into an erect and dignified posture. Actually ride with full awareness on the waves of the breath at the belly.
Drop in.
Yeah.
Okay.
So waking up, of course, is what it's all about. I mean, it's about being awake, right?
Yeah.
But there's waking up and then there's waking up. So you can wake up. What it means to actually live in the mindfulness curriculum that was developed on Cape Cod for the schools there called Clever Comparison Group, a coding class, okay, which should actually make you big bucks. The Buddha saw it 2,600 years ago, and his vision, I would say, is more essential and more needed and more important and more in the world than it has ever been up to this point in time. I love that. If in those years I had found something more powerful than the Dharma, do you think I'd be doing Dharma or MBSR? I'd be doing whatever that more powerful thing is. Personally speaking, I've never found anything more powerful than that Dharma. It's not separate from life itself. So this is what's so beautiful about it, is it's pointing to something that we all already have, or even better, we all already are. To know yourself, to befriend yourself. And of course, when you come to know yourself, the first thing you learn is that you're not who you think you are. You're much, 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 much bigger. And that awareness, then, that's boundless. It's like you can't find the edge of it, and you can't find the center of it. It's like the universe. It's like space. And there's no boundary. We have that as human beings, but we're not taught that in school, so we ignore it. So when you learn how to inhabit that awareness, that space, multidimensional, you could say hidden dimension of awareness that's only hidden until you realize it, then how you are in relationship to your body, it naturally gets healthier. How you are in relationship with your love, with people you love, they naturally get healthier because you're not trying to get something. You're just here, and then that's how you can be of use and care and step in and do stuff when doing needs to happen. So this is all part of the practice. I mean, I talk about mindfulness as being the domain of being. We do the doing out of being. When the doing comes out of being, it's a very different kind of form of action. So there's not one prescription for happiness or well-being. Everybody has to find their own way, just like the water going downhill finds its own way. So some molecules will go that way, other molecules will go that way, other molecules will stay for a while up there. So that's the beauty of it, is that we're not telling people how they should be happy. We're inviting them to discover how maybe they're already happy, maybe they're already complete, maybe they're already whole. And then they do it your way. Not like there's one way to meditate. There's only one way and you have to do my way. No, find your way. If you don't know, okay, that's the Zen koan. Don't know. So you stay in the don't know and you listen. You attend. You use your senses, including your heart. And you don't have to try to get anywhere. You let the world come to you. The way sounds come to you. The way thoughts just arise. The way things come to the eyes. You don't have to go out there and grab stuff and bring it in and fix it or work with it. Okay, that you're already Buddha. You're already whole. You're already complete. There's nothing missing. All you need to do is wake up to that wholeness. And there's only one time you can do it.